Welcome to the Moynihan Report here on the 2A Network. I am your host, Michael Moynihan, and I'm very excited today. I'm not often excited, but I'm excited today because we're talking to one of my favorite people, the sort of Zelig of the past 40 years. He seems to be everywhere. Jon Ronson, author, documentary filmmaker too, non-documentary filmmaker, podcaster, Minister, goats. It's really the hardest thing about doing this is trying to figure out how to introduce you.
Well, yeah.
You have too much stuff.
Sure.
You've done too many things.
Plus, I chronicled you once. So you've been publicly shamed.
Yeah, no, and I do feature in one of your books.
Yes.
So that is very exciting for me. And I'm trying to remember if I appreciated that portrayal. Did I like it or not?
I think you did. Well, we always bring this up when I meet you because basically this was a very different Michael Moynihan. This was a Michael Moynihan who was... you discovered that this pop science author, Jonah Lehrer, had fabricated some quotes and done some other sloppy stuff. And you were then put in this position as to do you write about it or not?
Yes. Yeah.
And so you contact Jonah and this drama unfolds between the two of you, which is really like something kind of like a Howell Pinter play or like, Frost Nixon or something of Jonah sort of pleading with you not to publish.
Yes.
And you were put in this kind of incredibly complicated moral position.
Yeah, it was something I couldn't come back from too, because I had told an editor, and at that point, the genie doesn't go back in the bottle.
Yeah.
But I did feel terrible about it. But the funny thing about it is this is before, was it 2013 maybe? 14?
Yeah.
Probably around there. So the book comes out 2015, is that
Yeah,
right?
I think it was 2012 actually.
So, I think there's a lot of words that often come up when people talk about you. One of the most frequent ones is prescient, right? All these things. We're living in Jon Ronson's world now, the world that you warned about in so many ways, all the way back when you're talking about conspiracy theorists and Alex Jones, to public shaming becomes cancel culture and all these things. And that was like kind of I wistful for those times in some ways when I had this kind of moral issue with, I'm going to destroy this guy's life. I felt really bad about it. And then I go on Twitter today, and there's people trying to destroy each other every nanosecond on Twitter, and it's just become completely sort of normalized.
And lying too has become so normalized.
Yeah,
Jonah Lehrer's transgressions compared to the transgressions that are constantly happening today, when everybody's just constantly lying about everything all the time, seem quite minor. But the reason why Jonah Lehrer was so bring downable was because there's a line in So You've Been Publicly Shamed where I say that our shameworthiness lies in the space between who we are and how we present ourselves to the world. Yeah. And Jonah Lehrer's space was as wide as the Grand Canyon. He presented himself as this kind of, smart, superior, sort of, college lecturer type. Yeah.
Quite handsome, photographs well.
And an expert, like somebody who would speak down to people. So he was very shameable for that reason. One thing that happened, and I read about this a little bit, and so you've been publicly shamed, and I think in terms of prescience, this was probably weirdly the most prescient moment, was that I wrote about this guy called Max Mosley, whose father was a fascist leader. He'd been done in a sex...
Oswald
Mosley. Yeah. Max was outed for taking part in what the News of the World called a sick Nazi orgy.
Correct, yeah.
But Max sued the News of the World because the orgy was definitely German army themed. But there was no swastikas, so we won.
So you thought it was like the Bundeswehr, it was West German maybe. It's like it was the East German army.
Right. Yeah. But when I was talking to Max, we sort of agreed that the reason why he couldn't be shamed was because he just stepped out of the pact.
Yeah.
He said a shaming is like a pact between a shamer and a shamee, and I refused to be ashamed. And that was very, unusual in 2015. Now everyone's like that.
Do people come to you after, and I know that you met people who had been shamed, who are not featured in the book, who kind of came to you and said, this has happened to me. You became this kind of magnet for certain people.
Oh,
I mean, we have
God.
some mutual friends that, you know.
Yeah,
that
I became a shaming imam, as my friend John Safran called me. Like to this day.
Yeah, inshallah, it will end.
Yeah.
But when you, at that point, were you telling people, I mean, did you have some advice, having sort of looked at this landscape, in how to best deal with it? I used to tell people, you know, don't go into the wilderness. Don't, because you'll stay there. And that happened to a lot of people that I knew. Whereas if you just go forward and either pretend that it didn't happen or say, look, you know, shit happens, I'm going on, that seemed to work better for a lot of people.
Wow, you see, I would say the opposite.
Really?
Yeah, and I don't say this happily.
Yeah.
Because, you know, humans are social creatures. If you've been misunderstood
Yeah.
or unfairly shamed or disproportionately shamed or whatever, then the instinct as a social human is to say, no, you've got to argue, blah, 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 and sort of explain yourself. But for the longest time, it may have changed now, but for the longest time, when the left was in charge, that didn't work. Anything you said was more evidence for the prosecution. Yeah. So what I actually started advising people was go completely silent. Really? And this is sad advice, because it's the last thing I would want to offer as advice. Yeah. But that is what seemed to work. Go completely silent and then slowly emerge in like 3 or 4 months' time. Everyone's forgotten about it. And, you know, people successfully got over shamings that way.
Yeah, I mean, I think something like Louis C.K., who went away for a bit and did come back. But keeping in mind, coming back for him, you had to have a measure of success to come back. Yeah. Because when he came back and did Madison Square Garden, he paid for it.
Yes.
Right? He rented it out. And by the way, and he also won, people used to say this, like, well, he won a Grammy for Best Comedy Album, and say, you know, it doesn't even matter. There's no such thing as shaming, until you realize that it was a secret ballot. The secret ballot was quite important for that.
That's interesting,
right?
yeah.
And renting out the garden on his own, and just doing it on his own, because it seemed that for a while that there was a disconnect between this kind of upper crust of people that were doing the shaming or enforcing the shaming, and the rest of the people who actually really didn't care.
Well, Louis C.K. was so interesting because he was able to do it because he had a big mailing list. Yeah. So he just realized, you know what? The gatekeepers are never going to let me back in. I think that's changed now. I think he now will be let back in if he wants to be back in. But at the time, it's like, they're never going to let me back in. So I'm just going to sell direct to my fans. So he would turn up at these cities and play pretty big shows. And nobody, except for people in the room, knew the shows had even happened. Yeah. He was, speaking directly to his fans. He bought all of his old shows back off of HBO and sold them direct on his website. He sold his tickets that way too. He sold out Madison Square Garden that way, as you say. His first line at this Madison Square Garden show was, everybody here has someone in their life that doesn't know they're here. Yeah. And I thought that was very resonant of this moment, where if you can't convince the gatekeepers to let you back in, then just shoo the gatekeepers completely. He became like a sort of cultural separatist.
Yeah, I mean, when you hear people say, I mean, as the, Sheikh Amil Rahman of the cancellations, the Imam, Ronson, the Imam of cancellations, when people talk about this now, right, we seem to be very sort of far from it. There's been obviously huge cultural changes. You have...
Well, the right do it now.
The right do it now too, of course.
Right, or as I call them, those hypocritical fuckers who went on for years about how terrible, say, cancel culture is and free speech and blah, blah, blah. The minute they get the power, they do it all themselves. Yeah.
Give me an example of that, something you've seen recently.
God.
I mean, there has been a phrase that I think has been resonant with me called people saying the woke right. And I see that a lot on Twitter, and I sort of read it through and I say, yeah, that does make sense. There's a lot of there's a lot of mirroring going on.
Oh, it happens all the time. So it's hard for me to come up with one.
But so it's not political. It's not like it's not something that you find. And I know you don't like.
Oh, it is. I think it is something. Well, one example that actually somebody gave me the other day. This isn't my idea, but somebody said it to me. Was that congressional hearing where the Columbia and the Harvard people, and what they said was taken very much out of context and made to sound a lot worse than what it was that they were actually saying at the time.
Yeah.
About about does your code of conduct? Do you remember this story?
Yeah. No, I mean that was the playbook of the left deployed by the right, and instead of sort of race, class, gender, it was very specifically anti-Semitism.
Yeah, but also the way that they did it, taking a decontextualized, little slither of information and then, sort of taking it out and, putting that up on the pedestal.
I think it's probably hard for you to do an interview without Alex Jones being mentioned, because I think a lot of people first had contact with Alex Jones outside of the kind of cable access in Austin, Texas kind of people, and the people who got newsletters in the 90s, pre-internet. You get this sort of Ron Paul survival report with a little thing from Alex Jones or people like that. You went to Bohemian Grove with him. That was, I think, the first time I had heard of him. Did you ever have an expectation? Because your book didn't seem like a warning to me. It was entertaining. It was a kind of rollicking, good fun of look at this fringe that exists and has always existed. Did you ever think they'd get into the temple?
No, I think looking back, I didn't, and it came as a surprise. I remember being at the gym and I was on the elliptical, and Trump was on all of this. Was 2015 or early 2016, and somebody shouted out at a Trump press conference, "Are you going to go back on the Alex Jones show?" Anyway, Alex Jones, nice guy, and I almost fell off the elliptical. Like, of all the people I've interviewed, if one would have the ear of a future president, I wouldn't have.
What does that mean?
Alex.
I mean, this is the thing that I know it's a very big question, but it's something I've given a lot of thought to. But why did that happen in 2016 in a sort of smaller way in 2016? Like, he didn't go back on the show. It's not even clear to me that he knew who he was in 2016.
Yeah, I can tell exactly how it happened.
Conspiracy. We're in a real conspiracy world now, and they are honeycombed through the second version of the Trump administration.
Yeah, what happened was there was a guy who worked for Alex who was somehow related to Christopher Reeve, and
Superman.
Yeah, and he or maybe a different actor who played Superman. Definitely an actor who played Superman, and he suggested to Roger Stone that Trump goes on InfoWars. Now, if he'd suggested that to me, I'd have said that's a terrible idea because, Alex is so nuts. You're just going to put off all these moderate Republicans. But that's why Roger Stone's a better political operative than me, because it worked, clearly. Like Alex had however many million disaffected young people who probably never voted in their lives, who then went and voted for Trump. Or certainly some of them. So winning over that crowd of the sort of this sort of shadowy people who live on the fringes, the 6.7 million men who've withdrawn from society, to bring them into your fold, I thought would be counterproductive. Roger Stone thought it would be a good idea, and he was clearly right.
But you allow them into your party, and then they, start demanding that you play certain songs and serve certain drinks in your party, right? I mean, they're doing this thing that you invited them in, and they are quite wily and pretty good at politics in ways that surprise me, and have an enormous amount of influence now that I never suspected. It's one thing to talk to the fringe and sort of try to bring them into your coalition. It's another to bring them in and they sort of take over your coalition in a way.
Yeah, and that kind of did seem to happen to an extent with Trump. I'm trying to think of more. I feel bad for a few minutes ago when you said, give me some more examples of the right being the shamers.
Well, I'll tell you what, I'll give you an example of something that I saw this morning. And, somebody who I don't really love because these comedians that became kind of political operators.
Okay, but Libs of TikTok, by the way.
Was that Libs? Yeah, that's a very good one.
Yeah, that's a perfect example.
That is a very good one.
And
get the people fired.
Yeah, get the people fired. Let's, Bob. I'm not saying that she necessarily encouraged bomb threats to those schools, but there were bomb threats to the schools after there'd been a Libs of TikTok post, and apparently it happened tens of times. And what's more alarming than that is that the fans of Libs of TikTok on the centre-right had no idea this was happening. That's how fractured our society has become. That all of this kind of mayhem was happening as a result of her Libs of TikTok posts, and her fans didn't even know.
Couple days ago, I suppose it was last week, Joe Rogan, probably the most influential podcaster in the country, if not the world, had a debate
with Douglas Murray.
Douglas Murray and a guy named Dave Smith, who's a comedian.
Yeah, I actually listened to about the first hour of it.
Yeah, I mean, that's probably about enough.
I noticed that Douglas Murray went into it right away because he knew that there's no point in building up to this.
What Douglas Murray comes into this debate, and I think that this is pretty fascinating, and he comes into this debate with one goal in mind. And it's also interesting that he's been on the show before, but this was the first time he'd been invited, and he had to have a debating part, like, a debating opponent, because he has a book about Israel, and that podcast has become a little kind of right-wing anti-Zionist podcast in its way. And Douglas comes in and says, you have a responsibility. I mean, it's a very capsule version. I don't think Douglas would frame it this way. You have a responsibility as somebody that has this big of an audience to not put on cranks and frauds and liars and things like that. What is that responsibility? You've been writing about, sort of psychoanalyzing these people for almost your entire career. Do you feel a responsibility? I mean, I got into your book in a way for feeling a certain responsibility about an individual person, not the ripple effects of it. But Libs of TikTok, you said, people are doing she can very easily say, look, I'm not telling anyone to do a bomb threat. Come on, this is this is not me doing this. Joe Rogan, these people that have these huge platforms, what kind of responsibility do they have, and who they put out there?
Well, okay, I'm always a little worried about sort of just answering in a sort of fly by the seat of my pants type way, but I'll, because I might say something that's bullshit, but I'll try.
But that's great. It's been good for clicks for us. We'll
I'll try and answer.
We'll publicly shame you.
Okay. I would say that Joe Rogan and Libs of TikTok are different, is what I'd say. I'd say that Joe Rogan, Libs of TikTok feels like a weapon.
Yeah.
And Joe Rogan doesn't feel like a weapon to me. It feels like he makes mistakes and he sometimes gets in the wrong people. But there's other times I listen. I'm by no means like a daily Rogan listener, but on the occasions when I have jumped in, he said some stupid things, he said some clever things, and sometimes he's fact checked live. He's got that guy who tells him what he's wrong. So it's a whole different thing.
And he's willing to say live that, okay, I'm wrong about that.
So I definitely have some sympathy with what Douglas Murray said, because it can be really frustrating that this sort of post-expert, post-institution world. When there's an awful lot wrong with institutions, the way that they, priests abuse children and healthcare companies, screw us, and the media will leave out the voices that they find ideologically unpalatable, and so on. So there's an awful lot of legitimate things to criticise institutions for, but there's also a big danger of throwing out the baby with the bathwater, because institutions provide some very positive things in people's lives. I think they give you like a sense of place. There's a book called A Time to Build, which is really interesting about this, that institutions sort of make you understand your responsibilities in life. So, God, I can't remember how I was going to head back. So going back to Douglas Murray, I do have sympathy with him when he says that, because I don't think we should all be jubilantly happy about a post-institution world where everybody's an expert, however much we don't like institutions. So I had some sympathy with Douglas Murray there, but at the same time, I think that... Joe Rogan has good shows too.
Yeah, I don't think the idea was like rule by experts in any way. I mean, it was saying that, if you have the opportunity to go to a place and see it, if you're constantly talking about it, do so. It doesn't mean you can't talk about it. There is a certain added thing that one gets by going. I mean, you could talk about Bohemian Grove, but being in the woods there with Alex Jones, watching them, set up one of their rituals or whatever it was, that is a different thing. I mean, you can write about that in a different way. You can think about it in a different way. But I am actually at the point where I celebrated for a number of years the destruction of the gatekeepers. And now I sort of miss them in certain ways.
I've been...
Not totally, but certain ways.
No, it's funny, the book that I'm nearly finished goes into that quite a lot about, our post-gatekeeper world and so on.
Is it a good thing or a bad thing? Just in general?
Well, like you, I have very conflicted, it's a very nuanced argument. I have very conflicted feelings about it. I think I've probably gone through the same sort of transition as you have. At the beginning, I was really anti-gatekeeper. They it took years for me to be allowed in with my weird lower middle class, awkward Welsh weirdness. To kind of convince people to give me a chance.
Yeah.
So as soon as things like, Substack and YouTube came along, I sort of think this is great.
But you've done it all in a world of gatekeepers. I mean, you've worked for The Guardian, you've worked for the BBC, you've done films.
But it was always hard.
Books.
I was never, the doors never swung open. There were always gatekeepers who wanted me out.
Yeah.
And then come 2015, 2016, when everything became so much more politicized and you had to be a certain sort of person with a certain sort of point of view to make it into certain legacy institutions, I started to really, hate gatekeepers all the more. Yeah. But like you, I kind of miss them a little bit now. I think as I say, I think institutions gave us a sense of place and purpose, and I just look at the chaos that is ensuing in a world without gatekeepers.
I mean, you navigated this world from 2016 on, where everything became sort of hyper politicized. The culture wars became the war. I mean, this was like something that I never expected to be as large as it was, and I think led to specifically the second Trump administration. I think the culture wars is a big contributor to that. But I listened to the series you did. You've done 2 of them. Things Fell Apart, which is a kind of this is like the text of the culture wars, all of these things, where they started. Yeah. And one of the things I always go back to is you talk about the Satanic Panic. And if people don't remember this is what happened in the 80s, right? Mid-80s, that there was, satanic cults, and people got a little exercised about this. And you talk about this in that the gatekeepers failed massively during that. I mean, that's one of the most insane failures. When you watch it and you say, how are these people thinking that there's, mass molestation and like satanic rituals and an enormous number of people, smart people at the New York Times, who you point out, but you don't name, but you point out at the New York Times, fell for this stuff.
Absolutely, and there were huge shows. I mean, the trajectory is fascinating. Will I quickly lay out the trajectory?
Sure.
So it starts on Christian radio. You had these guys like Bob Larson, I think his name was, if I've got him right. He'd have a Christian radio show, and people would phone up and say, "Well, I've just been, kidnapped, and I was taken to a house, and they had this big ceremony where I was passed through the body of a dead horse." And he was like, whoa. And then it turned into records, heavy metal bands and so on, if you played things backwards. But the gatekeepers came along and did these huge shows, Geraldo Rivera and people on other mainstream channels, not saying, look at this nonsense that clearly isn't true, but sort of prodding it, well, maybe this is true. It's a little bit like Amanda Knox, I think, in a funny way. That was, the idea of this sort of, good-looking 20-year-old American girl who's also a sex-crazed psychopath.
Yeah.
That's even though it was so implausible, there was no DNA, et cetera, even though it was so implausible, it was just too exciting a narrative to give up. And I think the Satanic Panic was probably too exciting a narrative.
In the documentary about Amanda that was on Netflix, if you were to take away, a villain, I mean, there's a lot of villains in that, the Italian justice system being the number 1 villain. But number 2 probably has to be the media, and specifically British tabloids. These people who, are basically saying, we don't care if this stuff is true. It's beyond if it bleeds, it leads. I mean, Foxy, Noxy, and all this stuff, it was fantastic copy for them. It sold newspapers. So when I see, Ian Carroll or whoever these people are that are spreading sort of slightly anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and sometimes explicitly anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, they learned that from tabloids. I mean, they've learned that from gatekeepers and from previous media institutions that, it wasn't clicks, it was buying a newspaper. You could never disaggregate what people bought the newspaper for. But, when I'm in the UK, I used to buy The Sun and Rest in Peace News of the World just because I was so allured by these hilarious, fun, interesting headlines. But there's quite destructive in so many ways, too. Yeah. And I can't say that these people who need gatekeepers aren't themselves influenced by the gatekeepers and were created in a way by them.
Well, very often the gatekeepers are nuts.
Yeah.
I was just thinking when you were saying that I do this live show called Psychopath Night.
Yeah.
In fact, I'm doing some more in November in the United Kingdom.
Okay.
One of my mystery guests was falsely accused of being a murderer and was imprisoned. And the way that they tried to get him to do it, they thought he'd murdered a woman on Wimbledon Common called Rachel Nickel. This criminal profiler, this sort of, one of these criminal profilers who turns up at a crime scene and, rubs his eyes and pictures what must have happened. And always says it must have been a young man. Living alone.
Yeah. So, which in the Man in Ox thing is they covered the body. Only a woman would cover the body.
Only a woman. I know. The prosecutor said that he knew it was a woman because only a woman would cover Meredith's face with a duvet.
Yes.
He really said that, and nobody doubted it at the time.
Yeah, it's bizarre.
Amazing.
Yeah.
So this guy, he starts getting letters from this woman. Basically, the police set up a honey trap operation to try and get him to confess to this murder. So this woman was writing him these kind of sexy letters, and her letters were getting darker. And she kept saying, I've got a secret, and I'm going to tell you my secret. And she told him her secret was that when she was a teenager, she was involved with some special people, and the sort of satanic people, and they had an orgy, and they killed a mother and their baby. And they slit the baby's blood, and they all drank the baby's blood. They slit the baby's neck and drank all the baby's blood, and then had this huge orgy. And then they killed the mother. And she said, and then I had sex with this man, and it was the best sex I've ever had. And I could only ever truly love a man who had done a similar thing. She writes,
how about you?
Yeah, so he replied, well, I think you're aiming a bit high. So that's an example of a gatekeeper.
And it's also a bad
insane.
way of doing it, just because men, if they're really desperate, might tell them a story that just to try to lure them in.
And if he had done that, it would have been, well, actually, maybe if he had confessed to it, then maybe he would have entered
What
up
is the
in prison.
instinct?
But the fact is, this honey trap operation was so bad that even if he had been the murderer, I think he probably would have got off.
Yeah. But what is that instinct to believe? You've dealt with so many of these people. Alex Jones is a comic figure, but he's a comic figure that has an enormous following of people that actually believe what he said. Somebody in the media, a prominent person in the media, said to me when I criticized them, they said, well, we checked Alex Jones, and most of what he said, 9 things out of 10 that we looked at were true. And, turning the frogs gay. Do you remember this whole thing?
Yeah.
Because there's a small kind of, there was some study and it did this. Yeah, and it's not turning the... So there's always that kind of little thing, but, somebody that I know, who actually I think that you know too, I had a fight with an argument with him about one of these things that happened in the UK, maybe 5-6 years ago, about the MP. There was satanic rituals with members of parliament and people being, murdered on stone slabs. And I said to him, this is bullshit. We have heard this a million times. But I think maybe it was because the people who were accused were Tories, but there's always this desire for it to be true. They want it to be true, despite the fact that there's no evidence that it is. It's like sort of motivated thinking in this way.
Yeah, I'd say it's a combination of ideology, which is one of the great sicknesses of our time.
Yeah.
And just excitement at a good story.
Yeah.
If you can put those two things together, if you can offer a really exciting story that also speaks to your ideology, then I think you're onto a winner. You've got to be so careful. This is how gurus operate. This is why I'm so careful. In my book, The Psychopath Test, and my show, Psychopath Night, the first half of the show is teaching people how to spot psychopaths, and then the second half of the show is making people feel guilty about their new psychopath spotting powers, because I think it's so terribly important to not be a guru, right?
I have about 1 million followers. Do a brief thing for me. If somebody says, give me a minute, 30 seconds, 45 seconds, you obviously can't do this, but how do I spot a psychopath?
Okay.
What's the easiest, way of explaining, here's a capsule version of how to spot a psychopath.
Okay, well, I'll tell you a story which isn't in my book. I was interviewing this guy who worked for the KGB. He was a British guy, but he worked as a spy for the KGB. He was a traitor. And so I was interviewing him. And
Can you say his name?
God. He was called a Romeo spy. So
Yeah, the ones that
Yeah.
got together with women and convinced
Yeah.
them to.
So if you look up British Romeo
Yeah.
spy, you'll find
Yeah,
him,
yeah.
because I can't remember his name. Anyway, I'm interviewing him. And what I noticed was he was, an interview is an empathetic process, right? You ask a question, I try and answer it.
Yeah.
He wasn't doing that. He was like blaring on for like 45 minutes. It was kind of nuts. Like he wasn't listening to my questions. He was just grandstanding about whatever he wanted to talk about.
Yeah.
So that sort of rang a little bell, because I remembered Robert Hare, the sort of king of psychopath hunting, said they can make terrible interviewees. So I said to him, okay, like when you were a kid, were you a bully at school? Mm-hmm. And he said, oh, yes. He said, I was a terrible bully at school. He said, I would hide behind a tree and I'd have like a bag full of bricks and I'd jump out from behind the tree and hit, a child in the head with the bricks and I'd really hurt him. And I said...
I think that goes beyond bullying. Yeah.
Well, yeah.
That's
Well,
sort of straight up assault.
So
Yeah.
early behaviour problems on the psychopath checklist goes beyond bullying. It's like really hurting somebody or killing animals or whatever, setting fire to your school. So I said to him, how did that make you feel? And he said, good. And I said, looking back now, how do you feel about it now? And he went, still good. So I said, and this is the moment, I said, would you say you're not the sort of person who feels empathy? And he says, you've got to the root of what a crank I am. He said, if I've had an animal who dies, like a dog, I get very upset. But all the people I've hurt and killed, nothing. So if you get them comfortable enough to talk about empathy and they answer it that kind of way, that's a good way in, I'd say.
You have talked at some length about growing. I think it's probably bullying is a mild term for what you went through in high school, right? And growing up in Cardiff. I mean, am I wrong to think that's the kind of a Rosetta Stone for so many of the things that you're interested in, whether it's public shaming, psychopaths, and these kind of extreme characters?
Human cruelty.
Yeah, human cruelty.
Sometimes I wonder whether that could be the case, that could be true. Try to work out, and I think being bullied at school is very good training for a journalist, because you'll agree with this. Like the most important thing for a journalist is to be ideologically unaligned. I think one of the worst things that's happened to journalism, and it's sort of stopped now, but for a little while in the mid 2010s. Ideology just became too important. I'm not saying I shouldn't say activism. I'm not saying activism shouldn't be in journalism, but I don't think it should become like the default. So that was happening a little bit. So I think a really good training for a journalist is to be bullied at school, because you're forced to the edge of the playground. Mm-hmm. You're not part of any group. You're an outsider looking in, trying to figure out why people are such like dicks. So I'd say that was part of the thing. But also maybe, like, why was I bullied?
Is it because you were physically small? Was it...
I think maybe I was just like a bit weird. Yeah. And I think I was just odd.
Yeah.
And I think that my oddness is probably the same thing. The same thing that got me bullied as a kid is probably the thing that makes me a good writer now. Yeah. Like I'm on the outside, I'm looking in, I'm trying to figure out why people behave the way that they do.
But do people like you and let you in as an interviewer to these very specific situations that are very hard to get into? I mean, when I talk to journalism students, I tend to say, the key to being a successful journalist is just access. I mean, everyone has good ideas. Everyone thinks they know what they're going to say to X person or Y person, but getting to them is the hardest part. But you get to them, and Tom Wolfe said that he wore the white suit because he stuck out so much. Because people were more willing to bring him in with the Hells Angels when he's wearing this, country gentleman suit from the South in the 1890s.
Right.
When you get into these places, I often wonder, when I'm reading your stuff or listening, how did they accept Jon into this? He's British. He's, you have a certain way of approaching things, which is kind of disarming. And I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but you seem to get access to places that I wouldn't imagine most people could get access to.
I mean, of course, you know, you don't know about all the times I didn't get access to
Yeah,
things
of
because
course.
those stories like never happened.
Yeah.
I think it's probably enthusiasm that by the time I approach somebody for an interview, I'm so excited about me. I get so excited
Yeah.
about things, like whether it's a record or a movie. You know, I want to like re-listen to the record like 10 times. And a story, I get that excited about stories. I get incredibly excited. So I think by the time I am approaching somebody for an interview, maybe my enthusiasm like rubs off on them. And I think if you write the email in the right way,
I pain over these things,
where you're sort of, you know, and it's genuine enthusiasm. And it's very rare that I'll write to somebody pretending to be excited about them when really what I want to do is stitch them up.
Well, yeah, you have that luxury now because you're successful. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, if you had an assignment from a newspaper and you're like, okay, I have to do this.
I mean, sometimes I'll ask somebody else, like if it's a difficult one.
Yeah.
Like I will never cold call someone. I just think I'd fuck it up. I'm convinced I'd fuck it up.
You don't doorstop people.
No.
Yeah.
I have doorstop people once in a while.
Yeah.
It's always quite exciting.
Yeah.
But I won't phone anyone because I'm worried I'll mess it up. So luckily my BBC producer for Things Fell Apart, Sarah Shabir, she's good at cold calling people.
Yeah.
So
What of those stories, Things Fell Apart, for those viewers and listeners who are not aware, there's 2 seasons, you should go listen to both of them, about the sort of making of the culture wars. Which of those stories, because I think I'm pretty well informed on this stuff. And I listened to both of those series and I was shocked by a bunch of those stories.
Me
And
too.
like, oh my God, I didn't know this. Which one of those stories kind of stopped you in your tracks and said, this is kind of scrambling my brain. Maybe I have to rethink a few things. I mean, that's what is fun about journalism in a bunch of ways. But often you do get pretty much what you're expecting. But it seemed to me on that one that there was a lot of things that came that were very unexpected.
You mean some of the sort of surprising origin stories?
Yeah, I mean, you know, characters that you know, the Tammy Faye Baker story and that the fact that, you know, I won't explain the story, but there were a bunch of things that stopped me in my tracks, and I guess I was a bit pompous before and said, oh, I know all these stories. I'll just listen to John's take on them. But there was a lot in there that kind of was like, oh, this is interesting.
Yeah, me too. And there's a couple of stories in there that seem so unbelievable that I've read people say, you know, that's not true. Ronson was just so in love with the story.
Which one in particular?
Well, one that I'm sure I'm right about,
Yeah.
but a bunch of people have said I'm wrong, is how the Christian evangelicals got interested in abortion. So basically, you know, 5 years after Roe versus Wade, the only people who were against abortion were Roman Catholics. Mm-hmm. There might have been a tiny little flurry of, you know, Protestant evangelists or whatever being against it, but, you know, almost just insignificant. And then you've got this kid called Frank Schaeffer, who's dreaming of being a Hollywood director. His father's a well-known Christian art historian called Francis Schaeffer. He convinces his father to let him direct like this art history documentary and put some scenes about abortion into it, just because he wanted some arresting visual images to show Hollywood producers. Gets 1,000 baby dolls, scatters them on the Dead Sea for like this, you know, visual image for his father's documentary. Really, you know, I mean, he sort of gave a shit. He was a 19-year-old kid with a kid and so on. But really, he just wanted a Hollywood career and he wanted a show reel. Yeah. But made his visual images so arresting that Jerry Falwell got radicalized and created the moral majority, and has said it was the Francis Schaeffer documentaries and books that radicalized him. If the Schaeffers had never come along, Falwell would have just been a preacher in Virginia. All these murderers in the 1990s shooting these abortion doctors had all watched Francis Schaeffer's documentaries. So there really is an argument that this kid who just selfishly wanted a Hollywood career and wanted a show reel, single-handedly kickstarted the entire anti-abortion.
But is he still alive, by the way? And you spoke to him?
Yeah.
What does he think about it now?
He's horrified by what he did and now wants to make amends. And his way of making amends is to like yell at right-wingers on Twitter. So that's clearly not
Is that right?
work. Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah.
I mean, in some of these stories, I mean, do you find people that regret. I mean, regret's a hard thing to do publicly.
Yeah,
Regret's a hard thing to do
did.
privately.
He very much regrets it.
Yeah, he very much regretted it. But you have, Jonah Lehrer didn't express a lot of regret when you talk to him.
No.
So it's not a common thing.
Yeah.
But were there people that expressed an enormous amount of regret for something that they kicked off that created either a movement or a little landslide that they ended up regretting, that you were impressed by them for actually saying, I this was wrong, or I should have not done this or rethought
Yeah,
this?
well, Frank Schaeffer's a good example of that. He hugely regrets it. As I say, I think he's done a little bit of a horseshoe because now he just like shouts at people in a way that's quite off-putting.
But yeah, I mean, that's usually the thing, is that if you're an asshole on one side, you become an asshole.
Yeah,
on
God,
the
I'm
other
trying to
side.
think about regrets. I mean, once in a while you meet like ex-conspiracy theorists who are very kind of regretful, ex-QAnon people and so
How
on.
did they get out of that? Because it always strikes me that again, we are in a very conspiratorial time, in the sense that the biggest podcast, right? Candace Owen, this woman who says Brigitte Macron is a man, and then finds the face of Judaism behind everything.
And also that
Carlson.
podcast show that everyone's listening to about how autistic people
Can communicate.
can have
The telepathy tapes.
Yeah.
It's one of the biggest podcasts in the country. I mean, we have a man running HHS, RFK Jr., who doesn't believe HIV causes AIDS, believes that vaccines cause autism, believes in chemtrails. I mean, this is wild stuff, and it's really in the seat of power. And I don't see that this is a moment in particular that would actually breed this stuff. If somebody said to me the most conspiratorial time, this isn't true, was Weimar Germany in 1930, I would say makes sense. I don't understand what it is about now that this stuff, is it the lack of gatekeepers? Is it, the media allows this stuff? Or that, Tucker Carlson, the biggest guy, talking about how he's been attacked by demons in his bed.
Yeah.
It's a weird place that we're at.
It very much is. I think the lack of gatekeepers has got a lot to do with it. Obviously, echo chambers have a lot to do with it. Also, the anti-institution people, the anti-woke people, so on, have been very successful.
Yeah.
Sometimes, there was woke overreach, but at the same time, when you dig into their way of fighting wokeness, it's very often, duplicitous and deceitful and, telling half-truths or lies or whatever.
But those are the people who became successful kind of professional anti-woke warriors. I mean, there's normal people on the left and the right who said this stuff has gone way too far.
You mean people who just become
just maybe talk about it periodically.
Yeah, I think some people are just born that way.
Yeah.
I remember when a couple of weeks into the pandemic, I was having a walk upstate.
Yeah.
And I met my neighbour who I adore.
Yeah.
And he said, and I made an episode of Things Fell Apart about this too. He said, have you seen this documentary called Plandemic? One of, the world's top scientists is saying that everything we're living through is a myth.
Yeah.
So when he said that to me, I remember thinking, okay, I'm going to watch Plandemic because I'm sure that's not true.
Correct.
He would
But he doesn't have that instinct.
No, exactly. Yeah. He would see me as almost like sheeple, too credulous, too believing in institutions and the party line and so on. And I saw him as, too credulous and I think sometimes, in that moment I thought, well, maybe we're just both born that way. He's a born believer and I'm a born skeptic. And maybe sometimes that's just like the kind of dull truth is that.
And you strike me as the type of person who enjoyed lockdowns.
Well, I did because I was having a bit of a breakdown at the time, and so I just needed some enforced relaxation.
No, but that when somebody comes on and says Plandemic, this is the conversation I've had with so many people who I've talked about it on the show, is that how does one combat bad ideas in an era where no one cares about the truth? You just cannot push back on this stuff. Tucker Carlson's not going to lose viewers if I do a comprehensive debunking of the fact that he wasn't attacked by fucking demons. He was in a bed with 6 of his dogs. Occam's razor suggests maybe it was the dogs that attacked him in the middle of the night. But, or Brigitte Macron isn't a man, and these sorts of things. These are easily dispatched with, but they're not.
Yeah.
Right?
The skeptics and the kind of rationalists, I think, by and large, did a pretty bad job of
Yeah.
it. Once in a while, there was something good. I think Richard Dawkins' God Delusion was a good book.
Yeah.
I could imagine some, secret, agnostic in the Bible Belt reading the God Delusion and, feeling less alone. But by and large, that old skeptic community, which I'm writing about actually in my next book, could be kind of assholes. A lot of people are in rationalism just to feel superior to people they consider less rational than them. So that's never going to do anything.
Which, by the way, is the exact same thing that motivates conspiracy theorists. In the sense that if you're at a dinner party, which I remember one time this happening, and saying something about 9/11 here in New York City, and someone saying, "Oh, you believe that? You believe that story?" There's a feeling of superiority, despite the fact that they were a crank and a crackpot and totally wrong about things, that you believe that, the Jews went to work that day kind of stuff. And it's always said in that tone of, I have the secret knowledge that you don't have.
Yeah, and you're never going to win anyone over. No, neither side's going to win anybody over that way.
What do you do as a journalist? Because I interviewed Alex Jones, and my producer said to me, this German guy, he said to me, he was like, there's so much that is wrong. Like, which ones are you going to go after? And I was like, none. And the reason you can't is you cannot win. It's impossible to win. Because, say like, Alex, that isn't true. And he's like, oh, Michael, I got a secret document that you probably haven't seen. And how do you respond to these things?
Yeah, and the answer is you're disarming, and you meet them as a fellow human being, and it's either going to work or it's not work, but that's...
And your job is not to debate them.
No, and anyway, I'm a bad debater.
Are you?
Yes. I think so. I think I'm a good storyteller, and I'm a bad... Because I'm not a polemicist and I'm not an ideologue, so I'm always living in the kind of grey area, and that means I'm kind of pretty bad at debating things, because I'm always like,
But you mentioned this guy who wanted to be successful in Hollywood and, maybe precipitates the anti-abortion movement. You've had a few...
Yeah, I think really does precipitate it. He really is...
Okay.
As I say, I've read a few people saying that, that can't be true, and, I'm pretty sure I'm right about. Like, if I'm wrong, I'm wrong, but I'm pretty certain I'm right about.
If not, the major factor, certainly a contributing factor.
Yeah.
You've actually flirted with that world yourself, with Hollywood, right? You made the movie Frank, which you didn't direct, you just wrote, right?
Yeah, I co-wrote it with Peter Strawn, who won an Oscar this year for Conclave.
Oh, we did that, yeah.
Yeah.
You did a film which nobody ever brings up, or a TV show. And I'm going to tell me if I'm wrong with the name. The Dog Thrower, was that the name?
Yeah.
With Matthew Perry.
Yeah.
Tell me about that, because I remember when that happened. It was UK Gold or one of these TV stations or something. But you get Matthew Perry from Friends, and you do a very weird show that is kind of about publicly shaming people, right?
Well, thank you for noticing that.
Yeah.
Because what happened was when I first started writing So You've Been Publicly Shamed, just around the same time that I met you.
Yeah.
You were pretty much the first person I met for that book, I think.
Possibly, yeah.
Yeah, and so I was starting to think about public shaming, and particularly public shaming on social media, and I got offered like, did I want to direct like a half an hour? I can't remember how long it was, comedy, and so I thought, I'll just do a sort of public, almost like testing out my book.
Yeah.
I'll do a sort of comedy. So I asked Matthew Perry, because I knew he was a fan of the Psychopath Test, and it is this sort of bizarre, silent comedy about a guy. God, I haven't watched it in years. It's about a guy who goes to a park and throws his dog up in the air, and he's so charismatic, everybody starts throwing their dogs in the air. So it becomes like a fad in London, and people just throwing their dogs in the air and catching them, and people just think it's delightful, and everyone's doing it. And then the papers come along and say, no, this is bad, and then everybody turns against the dog thrower.
And the dog thrower is Matthew Perry.
It's Matthew Perry, yeah.
And he was a fan of Psychopath Test.
Yeah, Psychopath Test.
And this happens to you, by the way. People just say, I read your book and I love it, and I want, when I was on Friends, and then you sort of have...
And I said, well, in that case, do you want to star in a low-budget comedy where you throw a dog in the air?
And he says yes.
Yeah, I think he's sort of
that
reluctantly
that was an enormous mistake on his part.
Well,
From Friends to Jon Ronson's Dog Thrower was not the trajectory a lot of people expected.
Well,
but
I would hope that
Yeah.
he didn't
Yeah.
see it that way.
Yeah.
I would hope that he saw it more as like an interesting little
Yeah.
side thing that he could do for a week in London.
But that was not something that you wanted to do further from that.
No, I'm not.
You're hanging out with Matthew Perry. You've got a big budget, and that must be a pretty fun experience.
It
Right?
wasn't a big. It was a tiny budget. He paid for his own hotel. I didn't realize. I didn't hear that. I didn't learn to that till afterwards. Our budget.
Matthew Perry came to the UK and paid for his own hotel
Yeah.
because he liked your book.
Well, mainly because he wanted to stay in a hotel that was way beyond our budget, and he is, and he was very rich.
Yeah.
So him paying for his own hotel wasn't like the biggest deal. But what a lovely, I mean, what an incredibly lovely man to do that.
What did you think when you heard that he had died?
Just
That surprised you?
um,
He wasn't like on drugs when he's making your film. He was professional.
oh yeah. I mean, he
Yeah.
turned up on,
Yeah.
I guess in Hollywood, you have to turn up on time. And I'm always actually really surprised at how incredibly diligent and professional everybody is. Like I've watched, George Clooney at work and Michael Fassbender and, these 12-hour days on sets of,
That's the Men Who Stare at Goats.
yeah,
film.
Medstead Goats and Frank and
Yeah.
these are grueling days.
Yeah.
And
Do
they
you
all,
like it?
No, I hate it. I don't like it.
You don't like the Hollywood aspect.
No, I don't like anything about it.
Really?
And I'm not going to do it anymore for lots of reasons. Firstly, I just think I'm better at nonfiction. I think nonfiction's the thing I do best, and
Yeah.
we're not on this planet for that much longer. So why not just spend our remaining years doing the thing we do best? So that's one reason. Secondly, I find Hollywood. I mean, I've met some lovely people.
Yeah.
George Clooney was delightful.
Yeah.
But it's shockingly alpha male Hollywood. I went to see Glen Ross last night,
Yeah.
and you must obviously know it.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, Kieran Culkin played Ricky Roma, the Al Pacino character from the movie. And I said to my wife as we left, I said, I was like, my heart was pounding a little bit because everybody I know in Hollywood is like Ricky Roma.
Yeah.
They just like, offload. They just, they just like talk at you and offload and like, and they don't let you get a word in edgeways. And it's very, for somebody who's not like that, it's very debilitating. So,
Is it hard for you to be in America for that reason? I mean, you're very British, and the most British people that I know all came here and all stayed here. Martin Amis, Christopher Hitchens, Salman Rushdie, all these people, they're very, very British. They write like British people. I mean, Martin's books are Lionel Asbo. It's about an ASBO, which is an acronym you guys have to look up. But
antisocial
behavior order, yeah. And it's like he is British to the core. He died in America. You live in New York City. You do well. You have a place upstate. You have a place in the city. You don't have a place in the UK, do you?
No, but there's this little hotel in Clerkenwell called the Rookery, which I always stay in, and it's kind of like having your own place because it's like a little townhouse.
But why are you not British? Why does your home country not call you in that way?
Well, it actually, you know what? It actually does, and I go back a lot. I was back a couple of months ago.
Yeah.
I go back 4 or 5 times a year, and I always love it when I'm there. So I do really still feel very, very British. Most of the people who like my work are in Britain. I did this British tour for the Psychopath Test.
Could you do that here?
No.
couldn't.
Well, certainly not the crowds I was getting in Britain.
And how many people are coming out for something like
Like
that?
1,500 a night. And talking like 30 shows in a row. But then I sort of figure, I always see my friend Adam Curtis when I'm back in London, the documentary maker. And I see Adam about 4 times a year. And I thought the other
So one of your best friends is a conspiracy theorist.
Adam.
No offense to Adam, he's a brilliant filmmaker. Yeah.
But I did think the other day, if I was still living in London, I'd probably only, even though Adam's one of my closest friends, I'd probably only see him about 4 times a year. So I see him just as often as.
But are you here because of ambition?
No, now I'm here because we're settled.
You settled.
And
But did ambition bring you here?
No, it really didn't.
Yeah.
I happened to have had, I moved in 2012, and I'd had a good couple of years. I was doing a lot of stuff for This American Life, and I'd just done a TED Talk. So I kind of knew if we moved here, doors would be open for me. But that's not why we moved here.
Yeah.
The reason why we moved here was because every time we were unhappy in London, we just moved a couple of streets away. Yeah. And I thought, well, we went from Islington to Barnsbury, to Highbury to Highgate. Yeah. So why not just try something different? Like Kennedy with the moon landing, sometimes you have to do something because it's hard. Yeah. So that's kind of why we moved. Just it was really on a whim.
What do you think of this life of yours? In the sense that, I consider myself with a tiny fraction of the success that you have, amazingly lucky that I get to do things and I like to do. I get to go places and, look at stories that interest me and talk to people that interest me. What is it like, the kid who's getting his ass kicked by people in Cardiff? I mean, you have a pretty good life, don't you?
Yeah. But the only thing I really love is going off and doing stories and then being home and making them work as a piece of writing. Yeah. That's the only time.
At the end of the day, you're a writer.
Yeah. And I have to go off and have my adventures, which is another good reason to live in New York.
Yeah.
I made this new episode of The Debutante.
Yes, we should talk about this.
Yeah, which we must talk about.
Run out of time. Yeah.
And that was in Tennessee, and I could just jump on a plane.
Explain to people, but just to sell them on it, because it's on Audible and it's really good. And I've talked to you about it before. But what is the sort of premise of the piece?
Okay, so there's a woman called Carol Howe who lived an extraordinary life. She was first a Tulsa debutante, high society. Then she became a very enthusiastic neo-Nazi. She joined probably America's most unhinged neo-Nazi group and started dating.
That's saying a lot, yeah.
Yeah, and she started dating, I would arguably, America's craziest Nazi, a man called Dennis Mahan. So she was, when she was a goth.
America's craziest Nazi. Yeah, that's quite a title, yeah.
When she was a goth, her friend told me, her school friend told me that, they were both goths. But her friend was into The Cure, and Depeche Mode, and Carol was into Throbbing Gristle and Psychic TV.
Screwdrivers.
Yeah, the most hardcore goth industrial music. So so then she starts dating America's craziest Nazi. Then she becomes an undercover informant for the ATF and starts spying on the Nazis for the ATF. And while she's spying on the Nazis, Timothy McVeigh blows up the Murrah building in Oklahoma City, killing 168 people. Yeah. And a rumor began to swirl about Carol. Two rumors. Yeah. One is if her information had only been listened to, then the government could have prevented the Oklahoma City bombing. Yeah. And two, her information proved that McVeigh had secret accomplices who've never been caught, and there's a cover-up. So that was the kind of mystery I dug into with The Debutante.
But you couldn't locate her because
she vanished.
Either witness protection or she...
Yeah, she actually never was in witness protection, but she kind of may as well have been. In 1997, shortly after appearing on Diane Sawyer, she vanished from the world, never to be seen again. And The Debutante came out in 2023. On January the 10th of this year, I'm lying in bed and I got a message on Instagram from a woman who said, Mr. Ronson, I am reaching out because I'm Carol Howe's neighbour. I've been listening to everything I can about Carol because, and I heard your show, because Carol died on Monday in a house fire across the street from me. She was a complete recluse. About 4.5 years, she went inside her house and never came out. So I flew to Tennessee to make an epilogue episode about Carol's final days, which has just gone up online now as we speak.
In what you learn, and I think this is kind of a journalism question. What you learn from that interaction in Tennessee and getting a glimpse into her kind of squalid final years, does that change anything about how you would have done the first episodes? I mean, did you learn something about her in maybe why she was so eager to be a Nazi, a goth, an informant?
Yeah, I think I learned a lot. I mean, what I learned, I interviewed like 4 or 5 people for the epilogue in the end, including a family member and the person who was like closest to her in her final days, and her landlords and her neighbours and so on. And I think I've got a much, much fuller picture of Carol now. One thing, there's a sort of culture war element to Carol's story, which is that academics and historians on the left, the kind of people who want to say that the American far right is much more scary, dangerous, or organised than we like to think, they love Carol. They want her to be like a hero, because Carol Howe's story proves 2 things. It proves, A, that she wasn't listened to because she was a woman, so she was a victim of misogyny. And B, her story proves that the American right isn't this sort of fractured bunch of, some dangerous and scary, some completely harmless, kids in gun clubs, blah, blah, blah. They're actually a unified conspiracy intent on kickstarting a new American Civil War. And for them, Carol is proof of that, because Carol had evidence that McVeigh had accomplices and so on. So Carol became very politicized on the left. And so the fact that Carol became this, I don't want to go in too much because I think people should really listen to the show. But I think I really dig into Carol's character now in the epilogue episode, and I think it really sheds some light on that theory as to whether or not Carol should have been believed back then.
Yeah, I won't say my opinion on that because I want people to watch it. You should, or listen to it. You should go listen to it. But I did come out of that with a very distinct feeling about it that I think I was similar to the one that I had when I listened to the initial series of episodes. Let me ask you one final question, and we'll see if there's some Ronson fans out there that want to talk. What does all this say about how we are living now, in the sense that if you get away from the day-to-day of politics, the kind of horse race, this endless, like somebody says something crazy every day, there's a new threat to democracy every day, whether you think that's true or not. And when you step back from it and say, okay, how did we get here? That's a kind of Jon Ronson way of looking at things. How did we get here? When you see where we are now, somebody who's done the culture war stuff, somebody who has been kind of an early observer of Alex Jones. I saw Jimmy Kimmel, the comedian, say the other day, very surprising because he's very, very political, Jimmy Kimmel. And he said, us on the left, or the left attacking comedians, is why we have Donald Trump. This was just today. Something similar to that. I don't think he's entirely wrong. I think there's something to that. But when you look out here and say, oh, okay, this is maybe a little further than I thought we'd go, but this is, is that how you see it? Or do you think this is way beyond anything that you'd ever predicted?
I think it is way beyond what I ever predicted.
Yeah.
However, I think all the clues to where we've ended up are there in the stories that I've done throughout my life. I'd say, the popularity of Alex Jones, even when he was unknown. I remember going to gun shows in the 90s with Randy Weaver, and not to brag.
Yeah, not to brag. Yeah. Who was also a Nazi, wasn't he?
Well,
ish.
His wife, I think, Ricky Weaver was probably the more radical of the two of them.
Yeah.
Randy was, they used to go to Aryan Nations, but that's partly because they lived close by and they'd go to the picnics.
I don't suspect if you live close by, you'd just be going to get like a cup of tea down at the Aryan Nations.
Well, if you have white separatist proclivities, you probably would. But actually, the fact that Randy Weaver was, recruited as an informant shows, or unsuccessfully recruited as an informant, shows that he was less crazy than the other people at Aryan Nations, because they saw him as somebody that they could work with. Turned out not to be the case. So, but anyway, I went to gun shows with Randy in the 90s, and the tables with the guns, people would like walk by and sort of have a little look. The tables with the conspiracy VHSs were fucking packed.
Yeah.
They were the most popular tables at the gun shows.
Yeah.
So that's what I mean when I say, like, I didn't predict.
And now everyone has access to those VHSs.
Yeah. So it was always there. That sort of need, I guess we have as humans for magical thinking, not trusting our institutions and so on, sometimes for good reason. It was kind of always there. So that's sort of what I looked at in them, was like the rise of the relationship between conspiracy culture and political and religious extremism. And then, with So You've Been Publicly Shamed, I looked at how, I guess, it's a book about shaming from all but really it's a book about just how the left were becoming very kind of unlikable, really.
Which was not a word I think you ever used in the book.
No, and it's only now looking back at it, you just think, God, this was such overreach. It was so, I remember at the time actually when Shamed came out and everyone was yelling at me, and I sort of said, exasperated to someone, I said, no, people don't like being told what to do.
Correct, yeah.
And, and this is your Achilles heel.
There's no way that you'll remember this, but you have to trust me on this. I did say to you at one point, after probably 2-3 years after that book came out, that there is a political valence to all this stuff, and you were like, well, and I was like, no, I think right now, I'm not saying this is the group that will do it forever, and the other people don't have the capacity to do it, because you don't want to be political and you want to avoid that. I said it to you, and you said, I don't know. You wouldn't take the bait when I gave it to you at the time.
And you were right. I mean, I would argue that the anti-woke right, and I'm writing about this a little bit in my next book, will quite often skewer. Quite often it'll be half-truths, it'll be outright lies and so on. Yeah. I do think that the woke, despite times of like massive overreach and so on, and very unpleasant behaviour, and some of them just really not very nice people at all, I think have been hard done by to a certain extent. I think this sort of anti-woke backlash is based on quite a lot of half-truths.
But do you think that the Trump phenomenon the second time around, the first time around was very constrained compared to what we're seeing in the last 3 months? Do you think that happens, and with the ferocity and vehemence, had the woke stuff not gone too far?
I think it's probably a combination of the woke stuff going too far and the right being, surprisingly good at really angering people about it. Yeah. More than, I still hold a little bit of a candle for wokeness. I'm sure I've just annoyed a lot of your audience in saying that. Because,
no, we have a very mixed audience.
Yeah, well, because, I'm far from the first person to have said that, but sometimes it's just about being polite.
I don't buy that for a second. But okay, I'll let you say that.
Talking about that, but that aspect of things, right?
But I think that existed before the kind of forced bit of it. I think that politeness was always a thing that you could demand of people, and they wouldn't think it was weird. Whereas the kind of ideological aspect of it was that, as you point out in your book, I mean, it was about disproportion. That's what cancel culture and that sort of stuff was. It's like, you get fired if you're Harvey Weinstein, and you should get fired. And, you should even go to jail. But it was the disproportionate, somebody rapping along to a Jay-Z song in the car when they're 15, having
the guy out the window. Do you remember the guy out the window doing that?
There was like the okay, the Nazi sign, in that kind of stuff. That was like they were like truffle pigs.
You've got no argument with that.
Hunting for offense because it gave them some kind of it looked like moral courage to some people.
Well, as I say, and so you've been publicly shamed. It was like also we fell in love with our shaming power so much that a day without a shaming felt like a day, picking our fingernails or treading water. It's like it just engrossed us too much. We fell in love with it. And, many social scientists have said that if we commit an act of violence for moral reasons, the violence is always worse. Morality leads violent people to be even more violent. So I've got no argument with you there. But at the same time, I just think, the anti-woke people have been so victorious right now and are sort of braying so much from their victory. I just, just think that you should forget that some people would just there was massive overreach and so
Oh,
on. But
yeah,
some people were
backed
just
away.
trying to do a good thing.
Yeah, I've backed away from most of them, and find it really off-putting. I mean, I do think that
And lots of lies too. I mean,
Yeah.
there's loads of half truths, loads of loads of times you dig it, just like when the left was doing it. When the left was doing it, you'd dig into it and you'd realise that person hadn't done the thing that they were being accused of. And now the right are doing it, the same thing's happening. The people haven't done. They're no better at it. The shaming right are not better at it than the left were.
Yeah, and I mean, of course, the thing about it is the number of people who have said to me and come on to the Fifth Column podcast and said, well, this is what they use to get their stuff done, and they were successful. We're going to use the same tools. They might be illiberal and they might be threatening in some, but we need to do that too. You see that with the threats against Harvard University and Columbia, which, ideologically, those are monocultures. But the idea is, how do we win? Because everything else, writing books and editorials and treatises in the National Review or whatever, that didn't work. We have to use their own tactics. And it's looking back and saying the success of some of that stuff is a kind of, those are guideposts for us of how to be successful in the other direction, which I find insane, right? I mean, we have to save the Constitution by destroying it. We have to pack the Supreme Court because the Supreme Court's a liberal, right? I mean, that's all of those things, that the instincts that people have. And, the Luigi Mangione stuff we were talking before we started is, this is a bad thing, the way these healthcare companies, and as somebody as a type 1 diabetic who has enormous healthcare costs, I'm sympathetic to people who don't love American insurance companies, but we should, shoot down a father of two in the center of Manhattan and expect some sort of change is, to me, delusional, and it's the beginning of very, very ugly movements.
Yeah. And also so childish. There's a sort of teenage element to the love of Luigi.
I literally said this when we did the show yesterday. I said, this is a teenage. We were did a show last week talking about this and this Taylor Lorenz thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I've been contemplating. I'm going to do one more season of Things Fell Apart, and I've been wondering whether, instead of it being about culture wars this time, it would be about class war, because maybe that's going to be an evolution.
Let me ask you one. We're going to go to Tom in the UK.
And
so Tom, don't go anywhere.
Yeah, and I want to say one other thing as well. Can I say one thing really quickly? Just talking about the right now, that somebody who we both know actually said to me the other day that his editor, he's a journalist, and he said that his editor had told him that the purpose of journalism is to provide moral clarity. Yeah. Now, I think we can both agree that that's like the worst thing that you could possibly think of.
Yes.
And you'd think that an editor who says that is coming from the left.
Yes.
But this editor who said that was someone on the centre right.
Yeah.
So this idea of like journalism and ideology and activism being all wrapped up in the same thing, which is a terrible idea.
It's a terrible idea.
That's not only happening on the left, it's also happening everywhere.
Well, people on the right realize one thing, that they were, racking up electoral victories. Ronald Reagan wins 2 terms, George H.W. Bush. The Clinton years are the most conservative a Democrat had been, with the crime bill, et cetera. George W. Bush, et cetera. How they think about this now is that not only were those people wrong on policy from the right, but we were losing the culture war while we were winning the kind of small electoral fights. But as that was happening, Disney was, making everybody trans or whatever. I don't pay attention to these things. But they were, thinking they lost that. In the fight now is not about anything that looks like conservative policy. The Trump administration is not free market people. They're not William F. Buckley people. They're not talking about deficits and taxes. They're doing culture war stuff, but from the seat of Pennsylvania Avenue. And if that's the way they want to do it, I think it's going to end horribly for them, because the economic policy is so stupid and so disastrous. And that's ultimately the only thing that people care about. You like talk radio, you like going on Facebook and talking to your friends about, Trump and all that stuff, fine. But at the end of the day, everything's going to cost twice as much. You don't give a shit.
Exactly. I say this to my left-wing friends quite a lot, that MAGA people aren't necessarily as much of a cult sometimes as people think that they are. Just look at what happened with vaccines. They turned against Trump when he was pro-vaccine quite happily. And if the economy tanks, they're not going to be MAGA people anymore.
I mean, there's a thin layer of MAGA people that will always be, well, anything he does, they will be there and they will support it. Because people ultimately, this is what conservatives and Republicans discovered, they hold up their pocket constitution. They don't give a shit about that. They give a shit about winning. And they give a shit about their team winning. All right, John, thank you so much for this. And we want to go to, you have to put your thing in because you were listening to the party that was happening before. But we have, is it Will in the UK? Is that Will?
Hi, there's Tom here listening in London.
Tom, sorry.
Hi, Tom.
Hey, how's it going? I was just wondering if I could ask, did you ever cross paths with Russell Brand, and what do you think of his cultural shift now from being this kind of wannabe left-wing savior as he was in the past to now this Christian MAGA supporter kind of character?
Tom, send me your crypto wallet or something so I can give you money for the best question that I should have asked, because that's one of these transformations. You've had a number of friends, by the way, and we won't name any names, who have had those transformations.
Yeah, and the answer is I crossed paths with Russell Brand a bunch of times. I've been on his shows maybe 4 or 5 times, and he has been like a mystery guest on shows I've done in London, like on live shows. So I've met him. I've never met him socially, but I've met him like work-wise, like probably 10 times. I was so last summer I remember a comedian friend of mine said there's going to be a documentary that's going to like expose Russell Brand's. And this is why he's joined Rumble. She said he's joined Rumble as like kind of reverse engineering because he knows he's going to be like fucked by the mainstream.
Demonetized by YouTube. And things,
So he knows this documentary is going to come out, and he's joined Rumble because they're the only people who'll believe him. And whether or not she's right about that, I don't know for certain, actually, because another friend of mine who's a mutual friend with Russell Brand to this day says that actually a lot of his beliefs are sincere. Like I'm inclined to think.
I mean, he was baptized.
I mean, look,
quite publicly, and you get baptized late in life, fine, but you typically don't do it with a camera crew there.
No,
right?
I find everything that Russell Brand has done since that documentary came out, insufferable. His new kind of Christianity is so insufferable. And I also wonder whether my friend is right, that this whole thing was like a very clever way of still having an audience after the rape allegations came out.
And now he's
been charged. And anybody who saw the documentary would know that those allegations are very credible.
Yeah.
One of the women went to a rape center that same day.
Yeah.
This isn't some ambiguous thing. So I actually found it really
recovered memory or something. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. This is very clear cut, and I did find it dispiriting that Russell Brand could go to Rumble. And Elon Musk and Tucker Carlson and all these people would start saying, when you speak out against Big Pharma, this is what they do. They falsely accuse you of rape. And Elon Musk is like, sure seems that way to me. And it's like, that is a massive coarsening of values.
I mean, but imagine that. You have these allegations. They're broadcast on TV in the UK. Ultimately, it comes to charges. And you also have the richest man on earth, defending you and saying that you're being set up. I mean, it's funny. I mean, like my dad's generation, did you know anyone who died in Vietnam? I say to Jon Ronson, how many friends did you lose in the culture war? And it's not
a number. A number. On both the right and the left.
Yeah.
And the centre.
Do you think that there's any repairing of those things?
Sometimes I think not. I heard there's a very good podcast called Decoding the Gurus.
Yeah.
In fact, I mentioned this on the James O'Brien podcast the other day, that they said that, when you join cults, one thing you do when you join a cult is you quit your friends and family who don't share the exact same ideological position as you. Yeah. And this is happening more and more with people who aren't joining cults.
Yeah. You're not unique to Scientology.
Yeah.
The idea not decoupling, but what you do to your family and friends if they don't have the same.
Yeah.
Because you shut them out.
And it's happening everywhere. Obviously, it happened with QAnon back in the day, but it's happening. It's happening with every culture where you can think of. It's happening with Israel Gaza. It's happening with gender critical feminism. People are you know, ideology is propelling people into aloneness.
Yeah.
They're giving up their families and friends because they don't share the exact same ideological purity as them. And I think that's, and I've lost friends that way, and it's genuinely upsetting.
Well, I want to say to Tom that I'm an OG Russell Brand hater. And as a matter of fact, I think I precipitated a bit of a meme about Russell Brand because he wrote a book a long time ago called Revolution, which I reviewed, and it might have been the meanest thing I've ever written for the Daily Beast. And I put some of his sentences out there, and it became a thing in the UK. And if there's British viewers out there, you'll understand this. John certainly will. Maybe Americans won't. That you would read a sentence. You would read a sentence from Russell Brand's book and shout "Park Life" at the end of it. And for those of you who don't know, Phil Daniels, Park Life. They were incomprehensible sentences. And at that point, he tweeted something about me and said, "This is one of the greatest things that's ever happened to me." He said, "Yeah, these rich, high-class journalists will say anything," and I was like, "You're in fucking Forgetting Sarah Marshall. I'm in a studio apartment, and I don't know if I'm going to pay the rent this month." But I was attacked by Russell Brand.
Wow!
And I saw him as a fraud a long time ago.
Right.
So
I mean, the last time I met him in person was, I think, 2019, and I went on his show on, I can't remember what it was called, but I went to his house because that's where he recorded it from.
Yeah.
And it was very pleasant. You know, I got on very well with him, and he asked really good questions, and you know, we stayed and had a chat afterwards, and you know, it was that final meeting with him was really nice, and so to see, you know, what he's become
on his knees in a stadium next to Tucker Carlson, I think, praying. Have you seen these things?
And
in front of a crowd. I mean, it's like...
And they must know. The thing is, they must know. When Tucker Carlson and Elon Musk defends him and says he can't be a rapist, this is only because he's getting too close to the truth about Ukraine. Like, for fuck's sake, you know, like you know, the CPS and, you know.
Exactly.
They must know they're talking bullshit. And so what they're doing is they're defending somebody who is, you know, where there's credible allegations of rape for ideological reasons. So these, as you say, are some of the richest and most powerful people in the world.
And have, you know, this is the thing about gatekeepers going away, is they have enormous amounts of money from their current jobs, not just from their jobs in Hollywood. Russell Brand makes a lot of money. Tucker Carlson prints money and, you know, puts it in his pocket, pays his crew, doesn't have to go through an agent, doesn't have to go through a TV network. Jon Ronson, it's always a pleasure, and it's always too short, even though I'm sure we went a little bit long today. I always want to spend another hour because we didn't talk about music and all these things I want to talk about. But anyway, the new addendum to the podcast, The Debutante, is available on Audible. Go back and listen to the actual show. And Things Fell Apart, the 2 series, were on the BBC, but I think in America they're available.
They're like everywhere.
They're everywhere, right?
Yeah.
They're everywhere. But listen to those 2, the books, put money in his pocket. He doesn't need it, give it to me. But we're out of time now, so we will see you soon, and come back and join us. Come back and join us on the live stream and participate in our 2-way, and we'll see you on the next episode.